We're back for another episode of the FAMM podcast, and in this series, we've been shifting through the gears of what we call FAMM's movement drivetrain, the processes and principles of how a team like ours and a team like yours, as one of our listeners, can get in the best posture possible to go after the big vision, or how we like to call it, your kingdom movement opportunity. I'm here with my co-host, Derek Schuschler, FAMM's Director of Mobilization. Man, greet our listeners, and good to have you back.
Yeah, I got to say, it feels like we're getting our groove now. You know, we're hitting our stride a little bit.
Yeah, what's this episode?
This is episode 9 of the podcast. So it feels good. Weather's great. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah, it's
talking about
to be alive.
Drivetrain stuff.
Yeah. So back on the drivetrain, when last episode we were shifting through, kind of put it down into a high gear, revved it all up with the go to scale strategy, which is kind of my favorite, my specialty on the team. And then, when you come out of that on the drivetrain, you're looking, okay, there's a couple of more essential elements we need to get. And when you shift into the next gear, it's kind of like overdrive. And you're like, okay, we've got a lot of processes, a lot of principles in play. And now we're starting to focus on what we call the essential communication method. How are we going to communicate in a way to be heard? How are we going to have an essential communication method that goes across all the elements of how we're making disciples and maturing disciples, all the way to even mobilizing disciples to go after that kingdom movement opportunity? I can't think of anything more important than the communication of the gospel, the making of disciples, establishing people in the faith, and building up the body of Christ, to consider our communication method and understanding it is essential that we lock it down and make it as effective as possible.
Yeah, because we can talk, but unless it's actually getting heard by our audience, doesn't matter.
You betcha.
Yeah, so let's get this conversation started by kind of defining what we mean by essential communication method.
We're thinking about going after that kingdom movement opportunity and bringing in this principle of an essential communication method. What we're talking about is being conscious and aware of how we're going to communicate as we seek to go after that big vision that God has for us. And how are we communicating through that?
Yeah, so communicating the gospel.
Yes.
Communicating church planning, communicating making disciples, the faith, how to get to church, all of that.
All of it, that's right. We're seeking to communicate every element across the discipling grid and thinking, how are we now communicating in each of those lanes that's speaking to the learning preference and communication preference of those that we're trying to speak to?
So why do you think this is so important?
Yeah, because if we don't consider it, then what happens is, in this essential nature of communicating so that people can get it, we end up just falling back on our own preferences. And I communicate in the way I like to hear, and I communicate to my learning preference rather than the learning style, the communication preference of those I'm trying to speak with.
Yeah.
And what happens is I find myself communicating just to hear my own voice and communicating in an echo chamber with diminishing returns rather than making effective disciples and seeing people get it in such a way that they've heard, they've understood, they've been able to respond to it in obedience, and they could even take it and share it with others because it's hit them at their learning preference, at their worldview issues, and according to their communication preference, how they need, not just want, how they need to be communicated to.
Yeah, the danger is if we don't consider their learning preferences, their communication style or method that they prefer, you like to say, we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah, that's right.
And so if we're not considering it, we're just going to fall into our defaults, fall into what we're used to. So how did that hit you? Like when did that hit you?
Yeah, when I was I'd say it was about 16 years ago. I was just kind of doing my thing. I'd been honing my craft as a communicator of the gospel and a disciple maker and a minister, honing in the way I like to communicate, kind of developing my bag of tricks and leaning on my own personality. And as I was a missions pastor, another missionary came to my church, and we were spending time in my office and talking, and he finally whips out this book on making disciples of oral peoples. And in it, he started sharing with me a statistic. And that statistic said that 70% of the Earth's population are considered oral preference learners.
It's a high percentage.
Yeah, and when I heard that, I mean, it intrigued me, and I started leaning in and asking a lot of questions. And I knew that I want to communicate in such a way that I'm heard, right? That it lands not just on the ear, but in the heart of those I'm trying to communicate with. And as someone who has a heart for the nations and is very evangelistic, when I heard this statistic, it grabbed me. And the more I studied it and realized the truth of it, it really strummed the chord in my evangelistic heart to where I came to the conclusion that if that is true, which I believe it is, and not just for people outside of the United States, that even inside of the United States, this oral preference nature's there, then I need to become a master of this method of communication. And for FAMM, when we look at an essential communication method, we've chosen one of systemic orality as ours. That's our tactic of the way we deliver it. But for any other team, the tactic may change. But the principle on top of that is you're going to have to figure out what is the essential communication method necessary for me to make disciples out of the majority, if not all, of the people within the context I'm serving, and do it in a way that they hear. I mean, really hear it. And then do it in a way that they understand it, right? Not just that reverb echoing in their ears like Charlie Brown's mom, but they've heard it and they understand it. And when understanding comes in, then action can be taken. And what we want is obedience to Christ, a surrender, submission to Christ. But Derek, as you know, we're called the For All Mankind movement. We just want to be heard or understood, and we want people to respond, but not just that person. We want that response to be able to be shared with the second, third, fourth, fifth, and successive generations of disciple making from that person. And that's why an essential communication method is so essential, right? Yeah. Because the way you communicate says it all. Says it all.
So if one of our listeners is grabbing onto this, they're sticking with us through this Kingdom Movement opportunity discussion, they see that opportunity and they want to go after it. We're essentially telling them, you got to communicate effectively. You need to consider that. So what are some actions? What can they do to start on that path?
You bet. I'd start, if I was coaching them, which we hope this podcast is a bit of a coaching. If I was coaching them, I'd start with the first question. That question is this: am I, or are we as a team, communicating according to how we prefer, or are we speaking to their learning preference and the worldview of our harvest field? So that's the first question.
Some self-reflection on their team and themselves, on their communication.
You bet. And that's going to start them on a path of analysis, right? Okay, we've asked this question. We're grappling with it as a team or as an individual. Primarily as a team, it's even better. But when that analysis around that question starts to come in, we then give them a simple self-assessment. Okay, ask yourself this question, posture yourself up, and then give yourself that simple self-assessment of, okay, where do we stand? How do we line up on this about how are we effectively communicating to the various peoples, the various audiences that we're gathering across the whole spectrum of discipling?
So the team would rate themselves on a 1 to 10 ratio.
Yeah, 1 being the worst, 10 being the best.
And then explain what led them to rate themselves that way.
You bet. And there's a couple of questions that help with that. So I've asked myself the big question: how are we postured to be communicating effectively with the varying peoples and audience that we're gathering across, that's the key important thing, across the spectrum of discipleship? A lot of times when teams or individuals are conscious of their communication method, it starts and stops with evangelism. And then when it goes into the other streams of effective and holistic discipling, they just fall back on their Christianese or their bag of tricks, or it's up to everybody on their own to come up with whatever language, tools, and tactics or communication methods they're going to use. What we've tried to do at FAMM is bring a corporate language into that, bring a common language, not just language, but even a common communication method that is systemic across all the streams of our discipling grid. We're going to talk more about that later in the podcast. But in the analysis, as we're posturing up all these things, we give them 2 questions. And that is, all right, you've given yourself a rating. Well, first, kind of 3 questions, I guess. Ask, why did you rate your team this way? All right. So just from your intuitive thoughts as a team, whether you rated it high or low, Why did you rate your team? And Derek, most of the time when I'm doing trainings with teams, especially churches, of all the drivetrain stuff, this is the one they usually rate themselves real high in at first.
Yeah.
And then the more we dive deep into what it actually means, that rating starts to diminish.
What do they hear it as?
Yeah, they hear it as pulpit communication.
Okay.
Or marketing publications, or our internal communications, or our outward facing stuff.
Yeah.
But not how are we communicating the gospel to people? How are we communicating what is a disciple, what it means to be a disciple, to make a disciple? How are we communicating in the style and manner in the environments of disciple making that we're in? And how does that trickle down from our top communicator down to the newest volunteer that's communicating the heart and process of discipling in our team, church, mission team, whatever?
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, well, we haven't even considered that, right? Or if we have, we haven't considered it that much. Sure. There's some guy somewhere on the org chart supposed to be thinking about that.
Yeah, sure.
But we're not considering.
And it gets back to what we've been talking about with the drivetrain. I mean, this is all connected because this is more about the audience, that opportunity. That's who's in mind here with this communication method. It's the one who is listening, who is receiving it. Yes. That's who we're after. And so to have that, you got to have a movement mentality going back to the very beginning.
Exactly right.
And it's got to be reproducible across that disciple-making process. So it connects to everything.
So if we have that first question out there, the second question would then be, okay, what's your communication strengths? What's the strengths you guys have as a team to communicate the making of disciples, the whole process? What's your strengths, and how do we play to those? How do we get those integrated across the whole body, the whole team, the whole network? But then we have to ask the third question is, what are our communication weaknesses?
What are the gaps?
And how do we minimize those, right? There may be some inherent ones that we have, some ones we haven't thought about yet, but we need to minimize and overcome those and play to our strengths and aggressively develop an essential communication method so that we can go after the kingdom movement opportunity God's put for us for these people, right? So they can hear, so they can understand, so they can be obedient. And the grand poobah, if I could throw back to that, and what we're looking for is that those people then might be able to share it with others, right? Yep. And really see a successive movement taking place. But it's all going to start with the communication we have and how we communicate. It's going to say it all about the way we get postured for a kingdom movement.
So how have you applied this to FAMM, the essential communication method? How have you applied that to FAMM?
Yeah, when we took on our first assignment with FAMM, when we started FAMM and went into our first harvest field, began to look at those fields and see the people that we were going to be serving and realizing, just to be blunt, my bag of tricks I've collected over the last 20 years, they are not going to get us where we want to go in these harvest fields. The tools I used in communication, the technology I used in communication, the Western linear logical processes that I used to communicate, leaning on my literacy was not going to get it done. And even this, and I hate to say it, the way I lean on my personality and charisma and persuasiveness in a Western American context with all that, it's not going to get the job done for us either.
Yeah.
So the first thing I had to do was realize I need to retool. So everything went on the drawing board, and I made a commitment. And the commitment was kind of just to wrap it all up. I said, okay, communication is going to be key. So we realized we're dealing with a population that's 80% between functionally illiterate and totally illiterate. And if 80% of the men and women we're going to serve fall in that spectrum, then the way we've been using to reach highly literate Westerners is not going to have a parallel into it. So we're going to have to reallocate, redesign, and acquire different tools and processes because we're still under a burden to make disciples out of them.
Yeah.
As an old mentor in this whole aspect of virality once said, what do you do when you're still under the mandate to make disciples and get the word of God in people, but the majority of people you're talking to are illiterate and not all, if not all of them, oral preference?
Yeah.
You still have the burden to make disciples. And that's what I was feeling. So practically what I did was say, okay, here's what we're going to do. Everything that I do, or then we do as a team, and you were part of that team in the first year, everything we do it in a way, whether it's communicating, sitting, everything, but especially in our communication, in every way that we communicate, we have a mindset that says when we communicate to them, we want them to feel and then to say in response, as I was communicated to, I can do that. And I can probably do it better than KP did. That was our standard. I can do it, and I can do it better than they can. And that's a little bit different than it is, I bet, at a typical church all of our listeners go to. When they hear the pastor preach, there's not a whole lot of people sitting out in the pews and say, I can do that better than him. Yeah. And, I can do that, and I can do it better than he can.
Yeah.
But what we said is we want everything that we communicate. I can do it. I think I could probably do it better. And the reason they can do it better is because, man, this is my first language I'm going to be communicating, not a second or third language, they're saying. I know the people intuitively, their culture, their customs, their habits, their fears, their issues going on. I'm part of them. I'm one of them. KP's struggling to make communication connections. This is easy for me to do. I can take that, but I had to put it out there and communicate in such a way that it was sticky enough that they said, I can do that.
Yeah, so I'd love to get personal on this.
Yeah.
Because you are a great communicator, and you do. I mean, here in the office, you're telling stories. The way that you communicate, you lean on your experiences, you lean on your giftings. I mean, it's phenomenal. But to put that not aside, and I don't want to boost you up, but how do you put that aside and put that mentality of I want to do whatever's best to communicate this to reproducibility and have them do it better than I? What does that take to put that on?
Yeah. Well, I think it goes to something we've been saying, kind of seasoning salt and pepper in this podcast, is the way you communicate says it all. And I knew that my mission at FAMM was to make disciples in such a way that would lead to a kingdom movement breaking forth. And that if it's going to be movement oriented, they're going to have to be able to hear it. And so if they can't read it, then they're going to have to hear it. And even if they could read it, they're still going to need to hear it. And if they hear it, then they've got to be able to understand it, because we're not just looking for change on the outside, or we're not just looking for change that's like situational or circumstantial. We're looking for worldview level change. So they've got to hear it in such a way that it gets to the core of who they are. Yeah. So what it took to get there was a recognition of where change needs to take place. And what it's going to take to get into that level of change and communicate at a heart level, rather than a preference level or situational level.
Yeah. We're not just behavior modification on the outside. Right. We got to get to the heart.
Got to get to the heart. So with that desire, we knew we had to communicate in a way we're heard, we're understood, they can be obedient. Another discipline that I put on myself, and you were there, is we said, we're going to only do it in a way that the way we communicate, when they receive that, they're going to say, I can do it, and I can do it better than them. And the second thing is all our communication processes and any materials or things that we would use, they have to be on the level that the most illiterate person that would come into our ranks, they can access it and use it. So, literate people can always reach down and grab hold of some tools, but the illiterates can't reach up and grab them. So we put ourselves under that kind of discipline that put those things in to get us in that great essential communication method spot, so we could pursue the opportunity God had laid for us with everything that we had.
Sure. So if a listener or watchers, they're headed down this path, they've got it, they want to do that, they want to have an essential communication method to go after their kingdom movement opportunity, what are some personal development or things that they can add in to help them down that path?
Yeah, you bet. I love getting into the personal development side, because really, whether you're an individual, a member on a team, or a whole team considering this, it comes down to personal onus. And when we think of, okay, am I going to communicate by my old bag of tricks, or by the way I like to be communicated with, or my preferences, or am I going to stretch myself to communicate at the most effective level possible to really get to the heart where change needs to take place, and strive to be heard, to be understood, to bring a change of responding in obedience and giving our people the ability for replication and multiplication. I would give this advice to anyone who seeks to really get that essential communication method locked down. Here's the first one. Be a perpetual student of your culture or your people group. And that's not just for those moving overseas. That's for the people that are dealing with the guy across the street, dealing with the community that you were born and raised in, is to say, I'm going to be looking at these harvest fields and treating them as if I was a missionary and being a perpetual student of the ever-evolving culture that I'm living in.
Yeah, that perpetual aspect of that phrase is important because culture is always changing.
Yeah.
It is adaptive. That's the thing about culture is it's changing.
I grew up in a town called Bentonville, Arkansas. And whenever I say, I'm from Bentonville, Arkansas, people are like, oh, it's amazing. You and I think's crazy. And it is today. But it's totally different than the community I grew up. I mean, it's night and day different. It's a city that's had great transformation. So if I showed up as a minister in Bentonville, Arkansas today thinking, oh, I'll just go in and communicate like how I was raised.
Like your grandpa did.
Yeah, like my grandpa did and everything, then I would be way off culture. It's got to be that perpetual student.
Yeah.
Second thing I would give is think like a missionary. Think like an apostle when it comes to how you communicate. And what I mean by that is think like an apostle in systemic communication across all the layers of the discipling process. Don't just think that way on one and then fall back on your bag of tricks, but continue to think that way across the board. What we want to offer for our listeners and participants on the podcast is this document that's going to be down in the notes. It is FAMM's reproducible disciple-making grid. It lays out 7 lanes of a discipling process and then gives a participant or a team kind of a worksheet to shape choices according to each of the 7 categories and then choose and make decisions on tactics that they're going to use, particularly of how they're going to communicate. Yeah. Good thing about a tool like this is it makes sure you're systemically conscious of your communication across the whole grid. Nothing gets left to chance. Nothing gets left out.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. And that you're talking about from the start, evangelism, gathering them to win, all the way to the planting of churches, this establishing of the body in them.
Yeah, and the mobilization of successive generations, right? Yeah. And making sure nothing gets left out and we're systemically communicating in the most effective method. Third thing I would say, Derek, is take that personal onus and commit to communicating in the way your audience needs. Now, I didn't say wants, the way it needs and it prefers to hear over our preference of communicating and being communicated to. And finally, I'd say this, just be mindful of and adapt to shifts in your culture from generation to generation and never find ourselves stuck in an antiquated mode of communicating. In that way, you're going to be in the best posture possible to go after the kingdom movement opportunity God's laid before you. What we've been talking about in this episode is following Jesus' example of incarnational ministry. And that's what it's going to take if we're going to see a kingdom movement in the communities that all of us are trying to serve in. Remember, the way you communicate says it all. Be sure to download our free resource, use it as a worksheet for your team. Make sure you don't miss out on any of the essential disciple-making grids. It's been great to spend time with you. Thanks for tuning in. Now go and be dangerous for Jesus.